War Department Secretary Pete Hegseth made clear today that U.S. military's operations against narco-terrorists have only just begun. And this is despite the recent bombshell report alleging that he ordered the killing of survivors of a boat strike back in September. Now, that's been walked back a little bit, but how fine of a line is the War Department walking? Joining me now to discuss this by phone is Andy McCarthy, Senior Fellow at National Review Institute and former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Andy, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Tony, thanks for having me.
You know, I want to get your take on this. I've been reading your pieces, and of course, there's been a little change in the narrative surrounding this. The Trump administration yesterday defended the legality of the September 2nd attack on the boat in the Caribbean. But is this gray area? I mean, are we talking about criminal activity? Or are we talking about warfare? Which is it?
Well, I think you mean the specific strike or the
how the administration. I mean, when we're talking about narco-terrorism, we're talking about drugs being brought into the country. Is this? I mean, we've had the war on drugs going on. I remember, Bill Bennett was the drug czar, and we had all kinds of operations going against drug running. But have we ever considered an open warfare as we're now seeing it with the Department of Defense?
No, we never have, and in fact, I don't think they're authorized to do this. I think we would have a gray area, Tony, if Congress had not spoken. But Congress has thoroughly, extensively regulated the way the United States and its government treats narcotics trafficking, which is including the importation of large quantities of narcotics from overseas. The way we treat that is as a prosecutable crime or set of crimes in the criminal justice system. It is not an act of war. The term narco-terrorism, which they keep repeating, is a nonsense term. It doesn't exist in the law. If you look at the very extensive definitions of terrorist activity in federal law, narcotics trafficking is not mentioned. There's one narcotics statute that deals with terrorism, and it doesn't equate the two things. What it says is if you earn financial proceeds trafficking in narcotics and you contribute them to terrorist activity, you can get a higher sentence for narcotics trafficking. That just brings drug trafficking into line with other laws that on the books that deal with material support to terrorism. So the two things are not the same. Even if they were, designating an organization or an entity as a terrorist organization is not in American law authorization to use military force. That has to come from Congress. So I think this whole thing from beginning to end is illegal, but the president has a lot of authority to use military force.
I mean, back in the 1980s, early 90s, I worked as a contractor with the State Department in anti-terrorism in their ATAP program, and we were dealing at that time mostly with narco-terrorists. We were dealing with those in Central and South America that were running drugs. We were training foreign police officers, but we had to be very careful. It wasn't a military operation. It was a law enforcement operation. And
right.
and that's how this has long been treated. But what really brought this to the forefront, we just have a couple minutes left, but what really brought this to the forefront were two survivors of an initial attack of one of these drug-running boats, that a second strike was launched to eliminate those two individuals. I mean, that's a problem, I would think, whether it's dealing with a crime, obviously if it's dealing with as a criminal activity, but even under the laws of warfare.
Yeah, it would be if that's the way it happened, and I think that's the reason the Washington Post initial report about this was so alarming. As you pointed out in when we began our conversation, a lot of that's been walked back in the last couple of days. What appears to have happened, at least this is the administration's account now, is that Secretary Hegseth gave an order to use lethal force against the boat, but he didn't say what would happen if there were survivors. It's obviously an offense against the laws of war and against American law to attack shipwrecked, defenseless people who are hors de combat. And it looks like what the administration is now saying is that the admiral who gave the order to do the second strike was targeting the vessel and the cargo, which apparently survived some of it, the first strike, intact, and didn't realize at the time that the second strike was ordered that there were survivors. That was something they figured out either when the second strike hit or afterwards. So if that's their account, that at least takes that war crime off the table, but I don't think it helps the legality of the overall operation.
So, Andy, 30 seconds left. Is this something that Congress has to determine, or who determines?
Yeah, I think Congress absolutely has to determine this. The courts aren't going to go anywhere near it, Tony, but it's time for Congress to step up to the plate on this anyway. If we're going to stumble into a war in the Caribbean, I think Congress ought to be heard on.
All right, Andy McCarthy, always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us.